We are unknown participants.
No, Augustine should have come in, yeah.
We are live now, and I will just start the recording also. Just give me a moment. So hi everyone and welcome. I'm Amrita Chaudhary and I welcome all of you to this discussion. And this discussion is basically over the competition regulatory landscape in India. Just a moment, I just need to check if the live streaming is occurring. Just give me a moment. Okay, yes, it is. Sorry, sometimes technology, comes to bite you at times. So yes, welcome to this discussion, which is Manthan, the competition regulatory landscape India needs. And I would be moderating this discussion and my colleague Samriddhi would be the rapporteur. As you all know, this session is recorded and live streamed. If you all must be aware that there have been quite a lot of developments in the competition regulatory space in the last few months, and over the last couple of days it was more. This discussion is primarily being facilitated so that we can get more clarity on the proposed Competition Amendment Bill 2022 and dwell on the various aspects and mostly on certain things which perhaps need to be refined if possible, understand more on the proposal to create a Digital Competition Act, and also kind of hear more on the recent developments such as the newly created Committee on Digital Competition Law, its mandates. And while these developments are taking shape, we also want to take a step back and think more on what India needs, to have a competition regulatory landscape that somehow is effective in balancing the sustainable competition, consumer interest, while also encouraging trade. And as an outcome of this discussion, we would be preparing a report with the key takeaways from today's session, along with our suggestions. We would be circulating it to CCI, the government decision makers, and other stakeholders, and all of you. And we do have an eclectic panel today of distinguished speakers who would be providing their perspectives on this topic. And we want this discussion to be interactive. So please do share your views or queries in the chat. If it's a question, please use the prefix question. If it's a comment, please use the prefix comments. And during the open house section, we will try to take as many questions and comments as possible. Please feel free to raise your hand then, and while speaking, do mention your name and your affiliation. Just a note, while we encourage you to be very actively participating in the discussion and sharing your views, do be respectful and courteous to each other, even if your views differ. We would not want any abusive language, personal attacks to happen in this platform. And when you're not speaking, please mute your mic. So after this, we would be having Avinash, Amarnath from Chandhiok and Mahajan, who would be giving us an overview of what the existing competition landscape is and about the recent developments. Then we will move on to the stakeholder discussion, where we have different stakeholders from different stakeholder communities who would be sharing their perspective. And we have Geeta, Gowri, who's the former member of CCI. We have Sudipto Banerjee from NASSCOM. We have Banerjee, who's the executive director from ADIF. We have Professor Viswanath Pingali from IIMA, Deeksha Manchanda from Chandhiok and Mahajan, Anupam Sanghi from Anupam Sanghi and Associates, Amol Kulkarni from Cuts International, and we will have Professor Shilpi Bhattacharya joining in later, who's from Jindal Global Law School. After this, we would be opening it up for your comments and then try and summarize the way ahead. So this is how we would be going. And without much ado, I pass it on to Avinash. And Avinash, you have 10 minutes to share a bit about what's happening, because not all of us are as abreast as you are.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amrita. Let me just start by saying that this thanking CCAOI for organizing this event, because I think we are at a very critical juncture in the development of competition law. So I must say it's a very, very timely and apt discussion to have. Welcome to the esteemed panel of speakers, many of whom have been my teachers and colleagues. Let me just start to, when I was a student of competition law and I was studying, I was doing a master's in competition law, I was told that it is now more or less settled that competition law is moving towards an economics-based approach, an effects-based approach. And in particular, we were taught about this theory of creative destruction, a term coined by Joseph Schumpeter, which essentially means that markets work in a cycle of innovation. It's difficult to put a time period on it, but after a while, a new innovative product or service comes up which disrupts the entire market and creates a completely new market. So the example that we were always given was 80s was IBM's era, 90s was Microsoft, and then 2000 onwards, there were a couple of them, probably, what we call the GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon. And we were taught that, competition law is a little restrained while applying to innovative and digital markets like this because of this creative destruction, because innovation works itself out and it is actually for the consumer benefit. So while dominance, it may appear that in a particular decade, a particular entity or a company was dominant or super dominant, there is a new technology or a new product right around the corner that will completely replace it and change the way business is done. So just, I would say, keep this in mind, because as I take you through the existing competition regulatory regime and the amendments, I think the question that we have to ask ourselves at the end of this is, are we still, at least in India, do we still believe in this theory of creative destruction, or are we moving away from that thought and belief? So when the Indian Competition Act was enacted in 2002, especially the online and the digital market space hadn't exploded the way it has recently. So at that time, we adopted a law which was fairly modern. We had borrowed best practices from more evolved jurisdictions such as the European Union and the United States of America. So it was a very state-of-the-art law. It had and the best thing about the Competition Act of 2002 back then was we had decades of experience of other jurisdictions to fall back on. So we could just simply borrow from that experience and come up to speed. The Act, of course, faced some challenges in implementation. Ultimately, the enforcement provisions came into force only in 2009. And since then, we've had a decade of this existing, and a little more than a decade, because even now the new amendments haven't come into force. So we've had a little more than a decade of the existing law being applied to the economy, to the markets in India. So the existing law is pretty similar to any other competition law anywhere in the world. There are three basic pillars that it has. It regulates anti-competitive agreements, it regulates abuse of dominance, and mergers or acquisitions beyond a certain size have to be notified for pre-approval to the CCI. And therefore, apart from the merger control aspect, largely the role of the CCI, especially on the antitrust side, or what we call, the anti-competitive agreements and abuse of dominance, it's more an ex post facto analysis. So once a conduct has happened, the CCI investigates and finds out if it has had an anti-competitive effect on the market, and then imposes penalties or some sort of remedial measures. Now, what has happened simultaneously in the economy, in the industry over this decade, while the competition law was being enforced, is that the way business is being done has undergone a sea of change, particularly in the online space. Two things that I'd just like to highlight. One is there is now an emergence of a platform or an asset-light model. So people have realized that you can use technology to just connect a seller and a buyer. You don't have to physically own the asset. And that has radically changed the way business is done. And secondly, two-sided markets have become a very, very big phenomenon in the online space, where you get the main product for free, but the revenue is being generated through a second set of consumers, for the advertisers, for example. Now, this, apart from other things, of course, there was, because it had been around a decade since the competition law was enforced, and with this new emerging digital business models, a need was felt to review the competition law. So in 2019, the government formed a competition law review committee. It was the mandate of that CLRC was pretty wide. It was not just about digital markets. It was to look at all aspects of competition law to see if it is sufficient. Are there any lacuna? Do we have to fill up those gaps, etc.? So there were various subcommittees formed under that. There was a separate subcommittee working on cartels. There was a separate committee working on abuse of dominance, one on merger control, etc. The deliberations went on for almost a year. And once the report of the CLRC was submitted, in around February 2020, we had a first amendment bill introduced, which broadly took into account the suggestions of the CLRC. Now that bill, till date has not come into law. For various reasons, it has been stuck. It has been introduced a couple of times, but not been passed. But while this bill was pending, a very interesting development that happened was a parliamentary standing committee was referred two things. One, they were referred this amendment bill and told, okay, please suggest any changes that you think are needed to the amendment bill to the Competition Act. And separately, they were also referred the topic of anti-competitive practices by big tech companies. So this is where all those, what Amrita was mentioning, the Digital Competition Act, and all of those things come into place in this report, in this second term of reference, which was to look into, or what we popularly call the Big Tech Report or the Big Tech Committee. That's where all of these issues come in. In December 22, both these reports were submitted by the Parliamentary Standing Committee. So there was one report on the amendments to the Competition Act and one report on the big tech practices. So to very, very quickly, and the panel will of course discuss this in more detail. I'm only giving an overview. But in terms of the amendments to the Act, some of the notable features, and I think let me just qualify this right at the beginning. Many of the amendments, in my view at least, to the Competition Act that are being suggested now are not very controversial, in the sense that these were actually things which were just missing in the Act that had to come into place. So for example, the most notable change is a settlements and a commitments provision is being introduced into Competition Act to allow parties to settle cases or basically close. So for example, if somebody is being investigated for a certain conduct and the party is willing to change that conduct during the course of the investigation, most competition jurisdictions across the world accept commitments from parties because it saves their investigative time as well. If a party is willing to change that conduct, then that's great, because their purpose is achieved. Similarly, a settlement is something a little different, in the sense that it is like it's like a plea bargain. So you admit guilt and then you get a certain discount on your penalty, and so you negotiate a plea bargain. So a settlements and commitments provision is being introduced. On the merger side, a deal value threshold is being introduced. So far, for mergers to be notified to the CCI, one only looked at the assets and turnover of the parties. But this meant that particularly in the startup space or in these new age businesses where the assets and turnover are not very big, but they have high valuation because of the potential. Such deals, the CCI felt, was escaping their scrutiny. So because of that, they are proposing to bring in a new threshold, which would be based on the value of the deal or the consideration that is being paid for the merger or the acquisition. Apart from this, we already have a leniency regime for cartels in India, but now this is sought to be enhanced to what we call a leniency plus regime, which is that even if a whistleblower has come forward to the CCI to report one cartel, he can get a further discount if he reports any related or other cartels that he may also have knowledge of. So this is again to bring our law in, accordance with international practice. Many other jurisdictions already have this. One of the unfortunate misses, I would say, in these amendments, and this was discussed a lot even before the Standing Committee and the CLRC, is that under abuse of dominance, the abuse of dominance provision, there is no explicit requirement for the CCI to do an economic effects analysis. So while many stakeholders did suggest that such a provision should be included, and the Standing Committee of the Parliament actually accepted that suggestion and recommended that that effects-based approach should be included, even the latest version of the amendment bill, unfortunately, has left that out. And the last one, which is also, I think, a controversial topic in terms of merger control, is that the definition of control or the threshold for what constitutes control or acquisition of control has been defined at a very, very low standard, which is what we call material influence. So that may make more, even simple strategic acquisitions, or sometimes just minor strategic or, just minority acquisitions also notifiable to the CCI. So this is as far as the amendments are concerned. Now coming to the big tech report, which is, the real hot topic. What the report seems to have done is review a host of business practices of the existing big tech companies. And then they have come to the conclusion, not very reasoned in my opinion, but they have come to the conclusion that there is a need to regulate big tech companies ex ante and not ex post, as I was talking about, as the CCI's role so far, as I said, is mostly ex post. So ex ante regulation would be certain strict regulations laid down in the law itself that you cannot do this, you cannot do this. So there is no scope to argue, there is no scope to actually carry out a conduct. There would be some very per se or strict prohibitions against certain types of business conduct. So good or bad, we don't know. And I think that's the question that is to be debated today. But they have reached the conclusion that there is a need for ex ante regulation. They have reached the conclusion that based on certain criteria, some big tech players need to be classified as SIDIs, or systematically important digital intermediaries. And these CDs, as we call them, would have certain greater restrictions placed on them. And of course, apart from that, the other major recommendation that is made by that report is that a separate digital competition act is required to regulate the digital players. So, going through this big tech report particularly, and this is why I mentioned this right at the beginning, one wonders, and I think that is where, or perhaps I would like to place this topic we're talking about. What is the competition regulatory landscape India needs? Because if you go through the big tech report, I think we seem to be going back from the theory of creative destruction. We seem to not believe in that theory because we believe that we have to catch these digital players before they become big. Whereas the theory of creative destruction says that it's okay, let them become big, because there will be a new player or a new technology that will eventually replace them. And therefore, you should not disturb that growth. And especially, and I'll leave this last thought for the panelists, especially with the advent of a technology like ChatGPT, one wonders whether we've jumped the gun with this big tech report, and maybe the theory of creative destruction is playing itself out. So I'll pause there and let Amrita take over.
Avinash, since it is just a news report and it is not something which is confirmed, there were also news through the news circulation that there are some new changes in the amendments, which obviously was not something which the Standing Committee had considered, for example, modifying the turnover to a global turnover for all products and services, or punishing the intention. So I'm not sure, as in, since it's not officially there, so maybe many of you may not be able to comment, but various stakeholders have expressed concerns, while some have welcomed it, but there are concerns. I'm not sure if the speakers would want to comment on it, but perhaps we could move over to these speakers, and later if you have something, Avinash, you want to comment on, please do come in and make your comments. So I'll open it up to the speakers now to share their perspective or their take on how they're looking at the regulatory landscape in terms of these developments, or do they think there is more to be done or less to be done? Also, I would actually go to Geeta, and I'm saying Geeta because I've been told by the speakers to take the first name, since you have been on the other side as a part of the regulator. How are you looking at it, and do you think the existing CCI has that kind of regulatory capacity to kind of take on a lot of things, and should we be aping the EU? Over to you. You are muted. You would have to unmute yourself, ma'am.
That's fine.
Yes.
Yeah. And Avinash made a very good presentation of what's happening, or what has happened. But there are certain things that somehow doesn't seem to gel still. I mean, we keep talking about the competition laws and economic law, but very little economics is ever used. We keep saying FX space, but the law firms all take over. So it's just a few of us with our dissent notes, we used to keep shouting, what is this? It hasn't been taken into account. And the reason why I say is not because a law firm shouldn't take over, but there's a very important thing to which attention has to be paid. There has been a mention of the fact of platform markets. And they have talked about two-sided, which is what Avinash said. While, the important thing to note is that the competition law in economics terms was based on what we call as a traditional product market. The emphasis was really on size and economies of scale. But when you take a platform market, the emphasis comes on network economics, where the whole scenario changes and you need to have as many users as possible on one side. If you have as many users as possible on one side, then more comes on the other side, right? Now, this sort of shift that takes place in how you look at markets. And now let's be very clear, traditional markets, even my grocery store doesn't come on the traditional market. Everything is online. Then how do you look at it? How do you regulate it? Should you regulate it? And this is where the Competition Commission has a very difficult role to play. And in playing with this regulation, they did come up with the ex-ante regulations. I don't know, I think Viswanath might remember the MCX NSC order. We tried to bring in the fact that it is a platform and talked in terms of how economies of service becomes very important. And perhaps we have to go back to that. But since you're only giving me 5 minutes, let me tell you a few more things to include. Now, the recent orders from Google is an attack on the GFAM or FAM, the Google, the 5 big tech companies. But there's also local big techs. See, one shouldn't forget that. And there's nothing wrong in global big techs versus local big techs, because that's how the platform economy works. And in this, what are the questions you have to ask? What is the relevant market? Can you define the market on a platform? I have tried very hard. I looked at all the definitions. I looked at the European Commission definitions. They couldn't get what the market is, because the market is so wide and it's global. If you can't define the relevant market, how do you define the abuse? It's a very major issue that has to be taken up, because the question of abuse of dominance, which, as Avinash said, they didn't use the effects analysis at all. In terms of abuse of dominance, and you're looking at a market, how do you measure dominance? SNP doesn't apply anymore. If SNP doesn't apply, then who is dominant? These are very basic questions that need to be looked into and answered. And everyone only talks about settlement. I don't know why. Ever since we joined the commission in 2009, I'm sorry to say, but all the law firms are interested only in settlement and commitment. I think the money is made in mergers, not in terms of antitrust and looking in terms of what could be the effect, both ex ante and ex post. So settlement is something that has been continuously talked about. And the other one that you mentioned is that of deal value. Yeah, that's a good thing. I think both settlement and deal value are good. Then the question of leniency. Leniency is something that's very important. And looking at it in terms of control. Now, when you look at all of them, what comes out is that it has been stated, even in the subcommittee in Parliament, that we will have two commissions. You are diluting the commission for antitrust analysis and getting it into the commission for merger analysis. And merger analysis is something everyone likes because there's a lot of work that can be done by the parties who are doing the merger analysis. And it's only 210 days. You can reduce to 120 days and get the audit through. But having said this, when the new act comes into being, it is very important for them to understand the aspect of platform market and network economics. I've written a lot about it, and as questions come up, I don't find it being addressed. And this is very important because it'll come up in your data usage and in the privacy matters. Because the government is also bothered about data. And they say about personalized data, and the big companies are taking away personalized data, and there's a lot of preferencing on them. But the local big companies will also do the same thing. And if you're talking about data, I think the third market, which is becoming important, much more than platform market, are data markets. And India has the most diverse data. So in a sense, the government of India and also METI has been put into a sort of, I wouldn't say contradiction, but in a very difficult position where traditional product market economics are of no use. They brought out that amendment, which is of no use. It had only one chapter on digital platforms. Then now they have come up with this committee, which has some good people. Sadly, only one economist, only our Aditya is there. And now they also have to think in terms of data markets. So the two markets they'll have to work out is platform markets and data markets. And the economics of both are very different. And this is a challenge. This is the competitive landscape because so much is happening and so much can be done. And this is not something that India should lose the advantage. And the big question that comes up, when should they intervene? Should it be ex ante as was done in the Google orders? If it is ex ante, is it simple rules like say, don't play in this garden, this is my garden, play in that garden? It's very difficult to develop rules. Or do we leave it to the market and then see how it functions? Can I stop here for a minute? Because there is a lot, and I've said too much, and others must be waiting also to have their turn. And perhaps they would disagree with what I would be saying. But you can ask me later on many of these issues, because we've discussed them in every commission meeting. Let me tell you, it is not that now the digital markets has come in and the commission has discussed. The commission meetings have always been discussing. And very often, I wish people would look at dissent orders, because there's a lot of work that goes into dissent orders and analysis. And then you can understand what is the relevant market, what is the abuse, what does it happen when you're looking at data. And when you're looking at data, the last issue is that of privacy. And the sad part of it is the European Commission, because of its anti-US business, is going back into a very funny kind of antitrust abuse in terms of Brandeisian approach. And I think the DOG also wanted to take over, not DOG, the FTC wanted to take over, and they've not been able to get. So there is really no very clear-cut picture. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And some of these issues, I hope, Amrita, you can raise it and put it across, and people will look at it.
Thank you, ma'am. I think you raised very important questions. The complexity, the cross-cutting nature of internet, which is going everywhere, the new dimensions which are coming up, which people are not possibly they are thinking, but not deep diving with that kind of people. I think more extensive consultation with necessary people, because things are changing. You need different kind of specialists when discussions are.
Just let me add one more thing. We don't have enough economists in the commission. We need more economists. We need a lot of technical people, to be able to understand what you call very rightly cross-platform movements, who will be able to understand the algorithms. Whatever you say, nothing is done with the algorithm. It's the algorithm which goes ahead and gets the pricing of other companies. And then that becomes a different debate. So we need technologists, we need economists. So the capacity building, and how large is the commission? It's growing smaller in size rather than bigger.
Right. I think those are certain things. And I think harmonization amongst regulations is also something.
Yes, that's also very important, because TRI somehow wants to go ahead.
Right. I'll come back to you, ma'am. Let me go to Sudipto. Sudipto, you represent many of the corporates. I know you want to speak at a higher level because it's very complex, but how are you all overall seeing this entire picture from, high up?
Hi, Amrita. Am I audible? Okay. Thanks, Amrita and Avinash. That was a very wonderful context setting. So just, as Dr. Geeta said, that what about the Indian big techs? So NASSCOM actually represents both foreign big tech and local big tech. So yes, we are very much mindful of that. The digital market has posed new challenges for antitrust regulators across the globe, which is actually kind of pushing the boundaries of traditional competition tools. So as an industry association, in principle, we think the exercise of correctly understanding the harms and identifying a menu of options would be a good way forward. So this would not only actually create certainty for the industry, but also larger gains for the society. But yes, we need clarity of the problem statement based on what evidence we have, and we take a risk-based solution, so that we do not want to generalize solutions and create unintended incomes. So I think, so in the context of this most topical issue that we did touch upon, that this recent committee that has been constituted by the MCA, we think that it's a great opportunity for the committee to actually look at this problem with a clean slate and take all the necessary logical steps before any intervention is arrived upon. So that would be my overall comment on the issue. And if I could add few more specific things that, we know, there is a lot of talk going on around this. The model which is being used in the EU, or the proposed model in the UK, or there is a model which the US is contemplating. But whenever we are talking about this global reference points, we should be careful that either they are very new or not yet in force. And most importantly, behind every model, they have their own unique problems, as well as, there could be also political, economic considerations. So I think we don't know what would be the outcome of the committee, but whatever be that may be, what would be relevant in the Indian context should actually guide the committee to think of any solution to address the harms. And also, if we could if I could look at the problem through two lenses. One is the technology route, which Avinash currently pointed out, that technology is a disruptor. So, take up the example of the public digital infrastructure. The kind of democratization it is trying to bring in the platform market, we could not have conceptualized that several years back. So, UPI is a live example of that. So, but yes, but does that have the potentiality to address all the concerns? Maybe not. Some of the problems might need a better, different solution. So we have to look at it from a from a holistic approach. Also, the other lens would be that, see, India is revising several of its existing laws, whether it is the consumer laws, whether it is the obligation on the intermediaries, or whether it is the data protection bill. So, I mean, the Standing Committee on Finance did refer to the data usage problem, but we would also, expect the committee to examine the issue in light of it's still in a bill stage of a bill. We're expecting to become a law soon, but we need to examine the problem also in light of the extant laws and the existing solutions that we can have before we create any new solution. So, just to sum up my, NASSCOM's perspective, I would say that we need to look at the problem from both technology and the legal route. And yes, there could be some problems which still might fall through the crack. And now whether that problem which falls through the crack can be only addressed through ex ante or not, I don't know. But the committee should use this opportunity to do that examination and arrive at reasonable recommendation. And as NASSCOM, we have always worked with our members as well as with the policymaker to understand their problems and to find ways which we can address not only the concerns, but also we continue to create an atmosphere where the ecosystem of innovation, and we represent several startups are our members. So we are equally cognizant of this fact that we need to create a solution which kind of addresses the harm as well as continues the innovation ecosystem in India. So yeah, I think that's how I would like to.
Thanks. I do understand you have diverse members, big, small, starting, matured, etc., global, Indian. So you look at it from various lenses. So we will come back to you. But now I will go to Bhupinder. Bhupinder, you represent ADIF, which specifically looks after the Indian businesses. Could you share how you are looking at this and what is ADIF thinking?
First, thanks, Amrita, for the opportunity to join this important panel, where probably all the stakeholders are present and we also would be able to present our views. So, when we talk about the larger picture, definitely in the last 2 decades, there have been cases in the digital markets with regards to competition, be it in European Commission or UK CMA, or even Korea, definitely very active through its Fair Trade Commission, and US through Federal Trade Commission or the Department of Justice. So definitely there is one fact that most of the so-called digital markets have some kind of competition issues which are being faced, and now all the countries are trying to move from ex post to ex ante. They were having the competition authorities, but now they are planning or they are in process to come up with a legislative framework. European Union has already come up with DMA. So definitely this doesn't say that, there's a need of a legislative framework, but yes, overall in all the major economies of the world, the governments, the legislatures are thinking to move it from ex post to ex ante. Now, why the need of such an approach? We probably need to see this. We need to examine this. One is when we talk about the digital competition, in most of the cases, like Avinash has mentioned, GAFA. So these are the few MNCs, if I can quote so, that have actually been part of the competition, abuse of competition, or the dominance of competition. So when we talk the things moving exposed, then the damage has already been done. It takes its own time for the legal fraternity to sort the cases. It may take a certain jurisdiction 6 months to 1 year to a little more. The problem is for the smaller startups, for the budding entrepreneurs, because there is some kind of restriction in the market. That's why the cases go to the competition law. So those are not able to revive. Like Geeta ma'am has rightly pointed out that it's very difficult to define the relevant market even these days because of the network effects and the platform effects. So there is a need of broad guidelines. Those broad guidelines can be in form of a law. Definitely Whether we want to deep dive into the final contours as part of that law, that's a different discussion. But yes, uh, I think that time has arrived where there's a need of such broad guideline in form of a legislative framework. And the Parliamentary Standing Committee rightly recommended a Digital Competition Act. Maybe there's a different discussion that, okay, they probably talk about 10 to 12 cases of abuse there. Whether those should be a part of the law or no, probably we can have a separate discussion on this. But yes, there is a need of an ex ante approach. I think Avinash also talked about that when we talk about the theory of constructive destruction. So there, he mentioned probably that, okay, the digital X or the ex ante approach would try to catch them young before they become too big. But if we talk about one recent running legislative framework in EU, that is digital market, not all the digital players or platforms are part of that law. They don't need to comply. They have defined some kind of gatekeeper provisions. I'm not saying that India need to copy it. I'm not saying so because every country has its different set of problems. We need to evolve accordingly. There are no benchmarks set when we talk about digital markets. But yes, this is something that has been seen across the globe that a small number of major digital players, they have become so engrossed as a market power that they are controlling the key channels of distribution, which we call platforms. So that's why there is some need because they control data, they control the number of users, and it's very difficult for the user to even switch platforms. Broadly, this discussion probably may go on and on, but if you talk about my or ADIF's views on it, definitely there's a need of an ex ante provision defining the broad guidelines, broad principles we can say, which need to be adhered by all the players, whether big or small. So I think I would submit this and probably would look forward to others' view in this esteemed panel.
Thank you, Bhupinder. And we'll come back to you, once this round is over, you may comment on the other points. Just one thing which I was thinking is, and which you rightly pointed is, India is different from EU. EU has their own issues, but India is very complex by it. As a market, the telecom rule, when it came, the strategy was very different. It was an India-centric strategy, which was not a global one. So I guess even the minister, when he was talking about the data protection, that's of course a different, he was saying that we don't want to follow GDPR, we want to have our own rules. So perhaps India may want to take good stuff as in what we currently think as best practices and try to create our own thing. It's just that, since you also represent business, you would not want it to stifle. And as a consumer or from, we represent users mostly, we would not want users to be abused simultaneously. I'm sure from the business world, you would want them to survive. That's a critical balance. In fact, we wanted CCI to be here today, but unfortunately they were not present. Hopefully, we will have more of these discussions, and we will try to have them also, because it's important they be part of these discussions in whatever way. So now I'll go to the lawyers in the room, and there are many who are observers, but amongst the speakers, so I'll go to Deeksha first and then Anupam. Deeksha, how are you looking at it? You represent a lot of companies and you look at it from the legal perspective. How are you looking at it?
Hi, thank you so much for inviting us here. I have been sort of itching to discuss session with someone since December last year. I think if I were to describe at a 30,000 feet level of what has been happening since December, it's a tightening grasp of regulation. And a tightening grasp of regulation which seems to be divorced from some very well accepted legal principles, but more importantly, with my very limited knowledge of economics, and I completely agree as a sidebar with what Geeta ma'am said. This is the law which is lacking in contribution from economists. We are party to bring in, and I think we need to bring them more and more into the room, because in what is coming out, I can see the lack of an evidence-based economic approach. It seems like we are putting the cart before the horse, as it were, assuming certain problems without actually examining whether those problems exist. And economics is probably one field which is going to give us those tools to allow and examine it. And I know we have a long session, so in the first 5 minutes, I just wanted to make comment on 2 issues. One was where I feel is an example of how I feel the new regulations are getting divorced from some well-established legal principle. And second is just touch on how I feel an evidence-based approach is missing from the entire discussion. So on the law itself, you mentioned earlier that we've heard reports that turnover may become the basis of imposing penalty on companies. And that suddenly sounds very jarring to us lawyers, and I'll tell you why. There is a catena of case laws which talks about the principles on which penalties are imposed. And all of it is largely based on principles of proportionality. Of course, it also draws on the reason of why a penalty is imposed. Is it, are you doing it to rectify a good compensation? Is it to penalize somebody so that their conduct is improved? Is it retribution? How are you looking at penalty? That's first. But once you've decided that, proportionality becomes a very important element of the decision-making process. And what global turnover does is to turn proportionality completely on its head. The CCI has been looking, and very consistently they have maintained that we are only bothered with what is happening within the 4 walls of India. What is happening within India? If you're outside India, we don't care about that. If you're participating in the market, then we are entitled to look at you, because you're impacting the consumers in the markets and the users within India. They may be business users or end users. Now, if my conduct and contravention is limited to India, global turnover does become a very disproportionate basis for me to impose penalty. And this is something that, very well-written judgment, in fact, in Excel crop by judges of the Supreme Court, which discusses how proportionality is important in discussions of penalty imposition. So I think that's one thing that very jarringly stands out as a, and the other that possibly stands out more as a student of competition law is no evidence anywhere, and this is not just India, but even in Europe, of why ex-ante regulation is needed. I went to an economic assessment report that the European Union had come out with before DMA came. They called it the Impact Assessment Case Study. Went through some materials by the OECD. And all I see is a lot of discussion about how some companies are becoming bigger. They're becoming better. What the line that the needle that nobody has threaded is, why is it bad? Exactly what evidence do you have to say that this is bad and therefore I need to regulate it? And I think that is one very important question for us to answer before we decide on the model of regulation. Because otherwise, as Bhupinder said, you will be saddled with a set of regulations that will lead to unintended consequences for all stakeholders in the market. Because we're dealing with a platform economy, which, if disrupted, can have impact on both sides. So it'll impact its users on both sides of the market. So I think some level of very careful evaluation of what the economics of this market are. Where is the harm? What is the harm? Have we seen an evidence of that harm? A very good cost-benefit analysis of introducing a new regulation. I think all of that seems to have been lost in our din of there's a problem with digital markets. So I think that is something that we possibly need to look into. And I think it would be great if the new committee that has been established actually brings in more economists. It would be great if people like Geeta ma'am, Vishy, all of them could join the fray to add those ideas into the debate as well.
Thank you, Deeksha. Thank you, for sharing your views. Anupam, I'll go to you, as in you have been fighting cases for clients in the court and have been, looking at the competition law for long. What's your take on this?
Thank you, Amrita, for having me over. and very happy to be part of this distinguished panel. I'll try to add value to this very vibrant debate that's going on. So basically, what I feel about this new law, ex ante law, I would first go to the fundamentals, and if I have to look at the need, I would want to see, where we were earlier. We were with MRTP that looked down upon size, big sizes, and it wanted to curb big monopolies. Since that law could not deal with the growing market, evolving market, we came up with a more flexible law, competition law, which deals with the market dynamics as they are. So we are talking of now dynamic competition versus static competition. So it's really more about understanding competition and innovation, and it's really about now relating to the digital market is really about understanding platforms and ecosystems. So there are so many types of business models and there are so many types of platforms. What are platforms and what are ecosystems? Firstly, that itself is not clear, that what kind of platforms are we regulating, whether a Microsoft or a Meta or an Alphabet, do they deserve the same kind of attention? Do they need the same kind of attention? So who and why are we regulating? And if you look at the need, then we would first want to assess our, local market, the need for, the Indian market. I would want to see a more comprehensive digital market study, the e-commerce market study. Now, I have been watching this space right from the beginning. And since 2014, we have very inconsistent, relevant market definitions. So initially, when the initial case of Ashish Ahuja versus Snapdeal, in that the CCI said, well, the online market is part of the entire retail market, so there's no need to define it. It's hardly 1%. And they did not bother to define the market. It was a good time to at least, whether it was part of the same or not, instead of, scuttling that away, it was a good time to at least define the market and to give some guidance on that. Then we went on, the online markets were not looked into. Everybody was very happy that, well, we will not be really looked with that lens of being regulated or being fined. So they didn't have any guidance about how they will be assessed. Then came the e-commerce market study in January 2020. And after that, there was a complete shift from there. And CCI started, looking at Amazon, Flipkart as different markets, Make My Trip as, as dominant. And they defined them as, sorry, I don't know what's happening with this view. But they started defining it narrowly. And that's when, the market definitions were also not very well, researched in terms of market data and market economics. And therefore, I feel, the market definitions were more of, very broadly defined, conflating market power from the market share itself. So the Make My Trip case, in fact, Make My Trip and OYO, which have both advantages of being on the digital platform, network effects, data, etc. But they were both defined very differently. And Make My Trip had a larger share in the market, which was allowed when they had a merger with ClearTrip. That was suddenly looked at as something that can create concentration. And so I feel, they were looked at differently. Again, we didn't get good guidance on relevant markets. So, and then you started suddenly, without giving a clear indication in your e-commerce market study, without giving an indication that we will be looking at these markets more closely, or they will be defined more narrowly, and this is how they will be defined. They started investigating, and nobody knew how to deal with it. Now, in this new law, the Digital Competitions Act, what is a SIDI, the systemically important digital intermediary? It is going to be, based on revenues and market capitalization, number of active users. Again, will that be the same at all the time? That will change. So we don't know how they are going to regulate it. I think what Sudipto was alluding to, that this is a great opportunity to look into the need to bring up an ex ante law, or to go deeper into our own market, study it well, is something that we need, at least now, before we draft a new law. Because look at some of the deals that have been seen even in other jurisdictions. The Facebook Jiffy deal in Austria was looked at more strictly than the UK market. So Austria looked at it more liberally than the UK market. The UK market did not allow the Facebook Jiffy deal, and the Austrian regulator, they said, all right, with some remedies, they allowed it. Now, when it comes to India, it will be a different way to look at it. So we need to look at whether we need these, whether online markets are complementary in our jurisdiction, whether they are helping the disorganized traditional market, and they to get them onto the online platform, how they can be more hybrid players, and how we can with the business model innovation, how we can help the entire market ecosystem to grow. This is where we need to see how competition and innovation can grow in our system, in our market, based on our values. What do we value? Do our rural market players, users, value privacy, or do they do they have some other socio-political concerns? So every jurisdiction has their values. If we look at our values, and if we look at our market with those value systems, and we examine our markets more deeply, we have deeper market studies, more nuanced, I think it's really going to help. And like Ms. Geeta Gowri alluded to, having more economists and technocrats, I think that's really the need of the hour. In fact, what you also said, Amrita, this is a time to cooperate with other jurisdictions and get some support from there. They have developed competition authorities, they have their research teams, etc. We have signed MOUs with them. I think it's a good time to make use of some of the processes that they use even before they come up with new laws. Like EU has not suddenly come up with this. EU has been looking at the digital market since 2015. And then, otherwise, what the courts need to do, you wanted the, the practical view on what happens in court. What courts need, what the courts do is then they read down the provisions. Like this relevant market turnover provision was read down because it seemed like you're killing the Indian players. So I was there, in the hearings before the Competition Appellate Tribunal when this was happening. And the judges would not understand, how this kind of turnover can be imposed on, how can these companies be penalized in this Excel Corporation case. So innovative term was, coined by Justice Sirpurkar, relevant market turnover, and everybody was very happy with it because it's, that kind of penalty would have really killed so many players. So this is why we really need to see our jurisdiction differently, or at least the Asian region must cooperate. We need, to find our own solutions. I think I'll stop at that. Hello. Really killed so many.
Thanks.
Players.
Oops, I think there was another thing which was playing, and that's why there was an audio.
Jurisdiction
thanks.
Differently, or at least the Asian region. Yeah, there's an echo, I think, for some reason. It's repeating.
Yes, it was. But thank you so much, Anupam. And I will move to the economist in the room. And, there was a lot of discussion about more studies, more economic studies done. So I would move to Vishy. Vishy, you've been hearing everyone. What's your take on this?
My first thing next time, Amrita, is that I should ask you to be one of the first speakers. You see a pen active in my hand and I have a notes in front of me. As Geeta started speaking, I started crossing out points after points after points that I wanted to make. So I really pity Amol and Shilpi in that way. They have to follow after me. So therefore, good luck finding something new to say in every sense of the word. So let me start out with something that Anupam said, and I'll build on top of it, which is that, I start my economics class by describing two kinds of individuals. Individual one is what we call as Homo economicus, the fellow who is extremely logical in nature and is more or less like a robot. Right? And whichever part of the world you take this fellow to, the behavior would be same, irrespective of gender, irrespective of society he or she belongs to, everything is identical. Unfortunately, I think we human beings call ourselves Homo sapiens, which really makes a lot of difference. We are really geographically, culturally, in so many ways differentiated from one another. Okay, so therefore, to me, the fundamental argument here would be, while what is true for you may in some sense be true for India, what is true for you is not necessarily true for India. So therefore, my opening comment here would be that, in fact, my co-authors and I are working very hard in understanding how the Indian tech market actually works and how the Indian ecosystem actually makes use of tech market. So therefore, what is my take on it? I don't know if formal and informal markets, urban and rural markets is the right take on it. So therefore, for the lack of better word, let me classify the Indian market into established and unestablished markets. What we notice is that some of my students themselves have started their own startups in markets which are highly established as being unestablished players. Sunk cost, as any self-respecting economist would know, plays a huge role in entry deterrence. So therefore, in a given day, if I were teaching this class in 1990s, I would have probably castigated that student and saying that you didn't learn economics enough. How dare you start a business in an established market? It's useless. You're not going to make money. But these guys say that I actually leverage the power of social media platforms in order to kind of make my life a little easy in terms of entry. So Geeta, I hope you remember some of the conversations we've had in the past. Economists are obsessed with the terms of sunk costs and variable costs for a while now. I think digital markets have actually gotten a completely new type of costs into the market, which we're not classifying at all. These are neither sunk costs nor variable costs. They're somewhere in the middle out there. And that's where, to me, the crux is, actually. So I think my whole argument for a competition law would be, please, whatever may be the law, you got to assess how the local unestablished market also plays out. 90% of India is informal market, 90% of India is unestablished players, not necessarily in terms of revenue terms, but in terms of pure numbers. Therefore, there is a significant chunk of the economy which relies on certain technological platforms that are available. So therefore, any competition law that kind of ignores the repercussions on it. So far, almost every study that we've done, we've even done a structured search of Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal and a couple of other really top entrepreneur journals that we've had access to. We couldn't find much literature on how they are affected. You see a lot of literature on how established players are affected with tweaks in the law. But you don't see many players, many studies out there which talk about how unestablished players make use of the existing frameworks and technologies. Sorry, I keep tending to use the word frameworks a lot because that's what sells in MBA class. So you use existing frameworks and paradigms, that's another word, by the way, a lot to actually start understanding. And therefore, I think to me, the fundamental argument for a competition law, my advice would be, please don't restrict your studies to talking to a few people in the established firm space. Look at what India is all about. It's a bunch of collection of unestablished players. I think Arvind Subramaniam, the ex-chief economist of India at one point in time in CCI himself mentioned that India actually suffers from the problem, not of oligopoly, but of actually perfect competition, which leaves with zero profitability as far as growth and expansion is concerned. So to me, that's an aspect that I would like the people to concentrate a lot on. The second aspect, and this is based on a paper that I published recently with a couple of co-authors, but albeit in the pharmaceutical world, but I'd nonetheless make a point. We show using data, very concrete data, that when policy uncertainty is present in the market out there, foreign firms suffer much more than the domestic firms do. In fact, actually, I can even talk about several industry associations that have actually come and helped us do this paper, including providing data very generously. Now, my whole argument is, as far as digital markets, as far as competition law is concerned in the country today, it's going through some bit of an uncertainty in terms of the core understanding. And I'm sure in the market, in the era where India is making noises as far as it being a global player is concerned, can we actually afford it? So that would be the second point that I would like to make. Make a law which is crisp, which is understandable. In fact, actually, one of the industry associations told me on patent laws, at one point in time, I really don't care if the patent law is adverse to us, we should know it completely clearly. And we'll figure out how to operate around it. So that's exactly my second point. There should be no ambiguity, because ambiguity helps local players, ambiguity hurts foreign players. And yeah, so that's my second point. The third point comes up. I'm not going to comment on the report because the report is not out yet. But whatever little I've read in the press, I'd like to say this, that one of the elements of natural justice is, two of the elements of natural justice is equality and equity. So if you're looking at the overall turnover and global turnover, that too, you may actually be missing both those points significantly. For the same punishment, for the same crime, two different players are going to get two different punishments, and it could be substantially hurting one player more than the other. So therefore, that'll be the final one. That'll be the third point. And the final point that I'm going to make is, as much as we started saying that these platforms are big, entry does not happen, data is the new oil. I can give you a bunch of cliches which I routinely use in the class, right? But you can see that there are 12, 13, 14 unicorns that have come out in India in the last few days. In fact, actually, I don't mind saying that some of these unicorns are actually by students or people from that have passed out from the same rooms that I've been teaching for the last few years. So therefore, the argument is, again, if you go to the creative destruction part of it, it's an ever churning machine. You cannot stop it. It is going to happen. At one point in time, we thought that these platforms are unfallible in every sense of the word. Today, we are hearing job cuts everywhere. Today, that there's something else that is happening out there, which is threatening the very core existence. I'm not saying that they're completely threatened. I'll be stupid enough to say, I'll be I'm not stupid enough to say that. But I think it's not true that they find themselves completely secure or any such thing. So therefore, to me, the fundamental aspects, if I were to boil down into bullet points, would be that one, local laws, local conditions for local regulation, policy uncertainty and the avoidance of policy uncertainty, and look for equality and equity of punishment at the end of the day. And finally, platforms are emerging, new platforms are emerging. It's not as if that we've said the last word on platforms, and there is a churn in platform markets. And I think there are several economists out there who are predicting platform bubbles. I actually saw also in the comment sessions on whether I can share some of my studies. Unfortunately, they've not been written yet. Data collection is going on. I am only sharing very preliminary results of what we are seeing in the market out there. Two of my students are at this minute interviewing a couple of entrepreneurs to understand their views. So I'll stop here. Happy to take any questions at a later stage.
Thank you so much, Vishy. As in, one thing which you raised, very important apart from the other points, is what about the small markets or the not established players? Because whenever there is a discussion everywhere, be it intermediaries or anything, it's just about the big ones. What about the people lower? That's also important. And when we are saying about SMEs, MSMEs, etc., how they are flourishing, or will they flourish, will they help, is also something. What is helping them? Even I would say, my presswala, we do most of the thing in some messaging platform that's helping him in his business. So I think those are
Amrita, just to give you an example, I have a student who is selling peanuts as we speak, really peanuts. I mean, chana, right? So therefore, and he has the dare to compete. I don't think he would have bothered to launch such a product at one point in time, 10 years ago. Today he does.
Right. No, and also if you look at it, there was Facebook and everyone thought Facebook was the end, but then we had TikTok coming in and it disrupted the market.
Absolutely.
We may ban it in India, but it is there.
Absolutely.
In the global market. So things change. That is also
you have Nykaa that came out. You have, I don't know, I mean, several platforms that one could rattle out, right?
Yes.
I'll use that.
So I'll go to Shilpi now. Shilpi, what's your take on this?
Thank you. So I've been listening to all the very eminent speakers, and it's been so fascinating. And I'm sorry I joined a little bit late, but I really, really enjoyed hearing everyone's views. So I'm a lawyer and I teach a course called Competition Law in Digital Markets. And we do begin by talking about how digital markets are different from other markets and the dangers that they present. So I think I'm just going to maybe give a slightly different perspective. As Dr. Geeta knows, I have like a unique approach to these issues. So I'll maybe present a slightly different approach. So I mean, we know that there are many features that make digital markets different, but one of them is that these markets do tip. And when they tip, then the result of that tipping is that it takes a long time for these markets to correct. So we have examples of markets that have tipped. Example is WhatsApp, where even though privacy is being reduced, we're still all using WhatsApp. There's an overwhelming advantage that WhatsApp has over much better products that are in the market right now. CCAOI has been trying to investigate the WhatsApp case, and it is just embroiled in all kinds of litigation, and it's going very, very slow. So this is an example of a market that consumers would benefit from more competition, but the regulatory framework of competition law in India is making it very difficult for competition to be corrected in this market, especially sort of all the ways that companies that Meta that have so many resources to litigate are just pulling the CCI into all kinds of litigation. So this is one example of why we need ex-ante regulation in India, which is that competition law enforcement is very slow. We know that, for instance, just the Android case took 3+ years to come out, and markets tip, and they tip fast. And we know that the CCI is concerned about tipping. They've talked about it now in a number of different orders, including the Make My Trip order. I'm not really sure whether it was justified in the Make My Trip order. But another example of markets that tipping that have totally tipped is Google. Google has, Alphabet has such an overwhelming presence across every aspect of our lives, from Android to search to everything, that it's going, even if ChatGPT comes, it's going to be very hard for Alphabet's presence to be, especially in ad tech and on the advertising side, for that search related monopoly to kind of be entirely dismantled. And one of the reasons why we are in this position, where a lot of us don't even understand the harms, because the harms are very hard to determine because of the way that data is used, the way that data is collected, the algorithms, etc. As the eminent speakers mentioned before us, we need sort of much more technical expertise to understand this. And because we don't understand this, we can't regulate it. And because we've been slow to regulate it, in the meantime, a lot of entrenchment of market power has taken place. Google has an entire monopoly over advertising, and a lot, almost every aspect of advertising now is happening digitally, and Google controls that. So we need to ask whether we are comfortable with these kind of markets where there are certain entities that occupy such prominent positions, and we don't fully understand what the meaning of that kind of prominence is, and therefore sort of is competition law enough, because it is too slow, and the way that regulation happens through competition law, you have to fit it into certain paradigms. As a number of speakers mentioned, sort of market definition is difficult. I feel we didn't correctly define markets in a number of cases, including in the Google cases. We don't understand how to define markets. We don't understand how to determine dominance. So I think it's not maybe such a bad idea to make markets more equitable, to maybe have an ex ante framework, just because of the real limitations that the competition law framework in India presents. And but of course, sort of the modalities of that framework need to be very, very clearly understood. So for instance, with the Digital Markets Act, we know that that's not a competition law regulation. That is supposed to sit outside competition law. But here we're talking about a Digital Competition Act. So how does that work with the existing framework? The eminent speakers before me talked about the goals and the objectives of this regulation. So we definitely need to have objectives that are consistent with Indian markets and with the goals that we are seeking to achieve. But we do have a broader set of goals that we want to achieve out of our markets, and it's not just consumer welfare, it's also having a level playing field, having freedom of trade. Those are important goals in Indian competition law. So it's very important, if we have a Digital Competition Act, to set clear understanding of what the objectives of such a law will be. Why do we want ex ante regulation? What are the objectives of that regulation? So for instance, if we want, we do know that sort of, digital markets create a lot of spaces for a lot of smaller players to come in. But we also know that smaller players are exploited through high commission rates, through self-preferencing, through data collection that is sort of their data is collected and not shared with them. So all of that is also happening. So we have to be very clear about what those objectives are that are going to be governing the new Digital Competition Act, and what is it that we want from such a law, and how will it play into the existing framework of competition law, right? Is it going to be an addition to it? Is it going to be something entirely different? And we definitely want to address the question of regulatory overlap. So this Digital Competition Act, how will it sort of interact with other regulatory frameworks as well? So I think those are important questions that we need to address. But as preliminary remarks, I think I'll end here, and happy to discuss later. Thank you.
Thank you, Shilpi. So I will go to Amol. Amol, you represent the consumers mostly, and like always, consumers come at the end. So I will bring you in just to give everyone an update. There were a few questions which came in the chat. If you would want to have a look at them, since we want to give people at least 20 minutes. So Amol, from 5, you can move to 7, and then we will go on reverse order when we ask the others to speak. But over to you now.
Okay, thank you so much, Amrita. And finally, the turn of consumers have come at the last, but hopefully we're not the least important stakeholders in this discussion. And thank you so much, Vishy, for sort of pointing out my point of view, because there's actually very less for me to say after all that has been said. However, I would try to sort of limit my observations from a consumer point of view in terms of what we are seeing, how the markets are evolving, and whether the creative disruption, which is really being talked about, is it really happening at the pace it should? So For instance, so here's the double whammy which consumers are facing. Over-regulation could lead to less innovation, which could lead to denial of services or difficulty in access to new services, which would adversely impact consumer interest. And under-regulation could lead to not addressing harms in a timely manner, which could result in another sort of a consumer adverse impact on consumers as a exposed scenario. So actually consumers are at the receiving at the both ends when you talk about over regulation or an ex-ante framework which goes wrong, then it impacts consumers, ex-post regulation which is currently in practice. If it is going wrong, if it is delaying, as Shilpi has talked about, then consumers are at the receiving end. So how do we ensure that consumers' interest sort of is retained and it's at the forefront in addition to whatever else has been talked about? And one of the things which I wanted to point out was that a lot of the speakers talked about the force of creative disruption, and there are examples in the country, so-called digital public goods and startup ecosystems and others, which could potentially present a challenge to the existing dominant players, and therefore consumer interest could be protected through innovation. However, for such frameworks to really present a challenge, we need to ensure that the regulatory and governance architecture of these sort of entities or these potential challengers is also optimal and in place. So I'll give an example. For instance, in the e-commerce space, the foreign e-commerce players are treated differently from the local e-commerce players. There is the FDI is sort of allowed only in marketplace model, but the sort of inventory-based model and marketplace model both are open for the domestic players. So in such scenario, can actually a domestic player and a foreign player be equated, and can the theory of sort of creative disruption play for consumer benefit? Similarly, when we talk about so-called digital public goods, I know there's the G20 sort of season, so therefore everything is a DPI. But when you talk about UPI, when we look at UPI's story, it was first open for banks, and it has been governed by NPCI. And then at very fag end, the fintechs and non-banks were sort of allowed entry. So if some particular entities are given first movers advantage, then how exactly are we thinking that these disruptions would benefit consumers in the way that they should actually? You gave example of TikTok. It is banned in India. So where is the creative disruption in the country which we had thought of? And similarly, we are seeing sort of innovations in terms of ONDC. However, there is no clarity about the governance framework which is there with ONDC, and how it would actually play out is something which is difficult to envisage at this stage. Vishy gave example of startups. However, we know that the digital sort of industrial strategy, which is the underlying theme in all the digital laws which is being introduced in the country, they want to create digital local digital champions and perhaps provide preference to some of the market leaders in the domestic space. So if that is the case, then really do we have the correct frameworks and optimal frameworks for the disruptive sort of creative disruption to play? And therefore, I think there is a need to take a step back and perhaps fix these sector-specific frameworks which do not allow competition to create its magic, and sort of remove these sort of disruptions which are there in relevant sector-specific laws, regulations, policies, frameworks, practices, and then think about sort of, okay, if we are able to allow markets to work, then do we need, in addition to that, a separate framework for digital markets? And that is the first sort of argument that I want to make. The second argument that I want to make is there was a lot of talk about sort of effects-based approach, which really basically, if I look at it from what has been talked about by some of the speakers before me, is that first we need to identify what is the relevant market. Then we need to identify who is the dominant player. Then I need to identify whether there is a abuse of dominance, and then eventually I will have to identify whether that abuse is resulting into some adverse impact for consumers. So actually, are we trying to make the life of consumers easier or difficult? Is my question. Because if you're saying that we have to go through this 4 to 5 step to actually establish that there is a problem in the market, then there is something wrong with this whole philosophy. And by the way, the effects-based test can also sort of be looked in from a different perspective, which is that if there is an evidence of adverse consumer impact on the market, then there could be a presumption that the market players are not competing in an optimal manner, and therefore the burden of proof is on the players to sort of prove that there is adequate competition in the market. So how would this effect-based test play is something which is really not clear at this stage, but I just wanted to highlight this point at this stage. Thirdly, I think there were some comments with respect to lack of evidence with respect to adverse impact of some of these big players. I don't think that is the case. There is a lot of example of what are the adverse consequences of some of the practices which Shilpi also had mentioned, and we shouldn't turn blind eye to some of the adverse impacts which are happening in the market. And as my colleague Ujjwal also points out in the chat box, that they were given an option of self-regulation, and then it was thought that if you are not able to correct your own practices, then the law should be triggered and there is a need for perhaps an ex-ante regulation. So I think the ship has sailed, and we should not continuously sort of ask for evidence with respect to adverse practices, but we should acknowledge that yes, these practices have been there. Some of these practices have been established in other jurisdictions. The recent CCAOI order has also highlighted some of these, and therefore let's acknowledge that there is something wrong in the sector and which needs to be corrected. And let's have a collaborative mechanism, as you and others have also pointed out, that what could be this. There has to be some sort of collaborative mechanism for the regulators, businesses, stakeholders, experts to come together, and not only economists, but consumer advocates, other stakeholders, which can actually highlight the findings from the ground. Vishy pointed out about the informal sector, and I do not see a lot of talk about or representation of these informal sector participants in either the committees which have been formulated previously or the committee which is formulated now. Thirdly, I think there's this talk of systemically important digital institutions, and this is not systematically, it's systemically. And this is sort of borrowed from the financial sector terminology, which wanted to regulate too big to fail entities in the financial sector. And they sort of created this term of systemically important, because if you are so important, if you fail, then everything else would fail, and therefore you need to be regulated differently. But the logic of the committee to use that terminology in the digital market has resulted in a lot of confusion, because here we are saying that you are abusing your power, or we are assuming that you are abusing your power, and therefore you need to be regulated differently. So I think there is a lot of lack of clarity in terms of how and why SIDIs, what should be the nature of SIDIs, how would it be sort of determined. And actually the standing committee says that the determination of SIDS should be revised on an annual basis, which is a good thing, which is sort of listening to the markets, and it's not set in stone once it's set in stones. But there's need for a lot more discussion around some of these issues in terms of what kind of gatekeeper regulation India needs, if it needs. So DMA might not necessarily be a role model, as we all agree. It could be sort of more of a regulatory sandbox kind of an approach, wherein that is one of the options that we are looking at, and we are seeing how it is playing out. And we think about and create and discuss what could be the other modes of regulating, including self-regulation and including co-regulation. For instance, in the financial markets and other markets, there is a huge thrust on data sharing between the regulator and the regulated entities. All of these SIFIs in the financial markets are required to submit reports on a regular basis and have heightened disclosures and talk to regulators necessarily on a more frequent basis than the normal other entities. So I think some of those principles with respect to better communication between large players and the regulator, for regulator to better understand how things are happening and what are the risks which are emerging, would really be helpful. And lastly, I would just want to end with the new concept of sort of hub and spoke cartels, which was introduced in one of the competition bills. And it's really interesting to look at because even if there is no horizontal agreement, it's about hubs which could be vertical in nature, but which are sort of forcing the entities to enter into sort of a common pricing arrangements, and which has some sort of narrow price parity clauses have had some positive consumer welfare benefits, while wide price parity clauses have been seen to adversely impact consumer welfare. So some of these developments are really interesting and need more discussion rather than just high level discussion around the kind of regulation. And just lastly, I think there were some of the provisions with respect to compensation to consumers, which were also introduced. I think these are steps in good direction. If you are settling...
Sorry, I will have to cut you because...
yeah, I was just ending that we need to think more about consumer, and we need to think more about sort of giving her its due. I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Vishy has to leave. So Vishy, your 2 minutes. And sorry, speakers, I am cutting your time. I will make it a 2 minute because we want to take some questions from the floor also.
So I have, frankly, nothing else to add than what I had said. I would continue to look for how the startup ecosystem is being disrupted, or how it is changing as we speak. I see both sides of the story. I have students everywhere, so I see both sides of the story. So therefore, what is working out is a study for me in progress. What is not working out is also study in progress. But I think there's something that I have to agree with what Amol is saying. I mean, I think these are good discussion points. Assuming one way or the other is, to me, a little bit of a, again, saying that it's like, yeah, making an assumption that Homo sapiens are Homo economicus is Homo economicus. They're not. I mean, they are Homo sapiens after all. There are cultural issues, there are other issues. So therefore, that's where I would like to stop my discussion on, if that is okay. Thanks for accommodating me.
Thank you, Vishy, and thank you so much. I will move to Shilpi now. Thank you so much, Vishy, and we'll be in touch. I hope this is going to be one of the discussions because we'll have more, but thank you for joining.
And
Shilpi,
thank you, and sorry, I have to leave a little early, please.
No worries.
Can I give just one point?
Yes.
It's pretty vicious, but the important thing that we must remember is that in this platform markets, we also have to think in terms of essential facilities. You have the ISPs, and then you have the OTTs, and they're all in the private sector. So that makes it very interesting. And data is the critical thing. Whatever you say, everything revolves on data, and that's why I said data markets. Who is going to sell data to whom? Isn't it fascinating?
Yes.
So yeah, Anupam, I'll go to Shilpi and then I'll come to you, right? Shilpi, over to you.
Thank you so much. I totally agree with Dr. Geeta that it all comes down to data. Data is the bedrock of digital markets. But because there's there is a black box around data. We don't fully understand how data is used, but we do know that a lot of digital markets are free because they're monetized through data. So data is really critical. Just very briefly to summarize, my view is that we definitely need an ex-ante regulatory framework, because we have seen the limitations of the competition law framework to regulate digital markets. It's just been very, very slow. Markets work very, very fast in the digital space, and we are not equipped from a competition law perspective, from the way that competition law works, to really govern the modern digital markets. I feel it's already too late, in the sense of a lot of society has already changed too much. So I wonder now how much we can really repair in terms of digital markets. Especially the harms around attention, the harms around social media, the harms around how we are being sucked into a very, very digital space more and more now with the metaverse. Everything is becoming very digital, and this is the way that business models work in the digital space, is to suck us in to more times being spent digitally, and we don't fully understand the harms of that. So I think it is important to have some kind of regulation. So far, we have zero regulation. We have just a few competition law cases, but we don't have anything else. We don't have a data protection law. We don't have any real regulation of digital markets. So it's really important to have some regulation, but the regulation definitely must be evidence-based. We must identify the objectives that we're why are we going to regulate? What are the objectives of regulation? And what are the harms that we're seeking to prevent through that regulation? So any regulation must be very well understood. I am a little concerned that most of this regulation will happen as sort of a lot of speakers have said, including Dr. Geeta, that there need to be more economists. There also need to be more civil society people represented in the panel. We don't have that. Maybe some academic lawyers as well. Not just practicing lawyers, because academic lawyers are more objective, just because they're not representing big tech. So to have more evidence-based regulation is I think, just briefly my last.
I will, be brutal now with everyone, but thank you so much. And Deeksha, I'll come to you. Just one point. I love technology because this is what is bringing us, and we somehow cannot go behind technology. We cannot go to some place where we don't use technology because it's cross-cutting, everything is intertwined. So I guess we have to take that into consideration. But Deeksha, sorry, not Deeksha, Anupam, I'll come to you first. I'm not a lawyer in this room. My concern is regulations are meant just for not today, but for tomorrow. Also, we don't know what's going to come. So how should it be framed? What are your last takes on it before we
Sure. Thanks for that great question. And I want to respond to that. And at the same breath, I'll respond to what Shilpi said and Amol said, because they brought in the different perspective of the lawmaker or of the lawmaker's perspective, that why the law is required and the need for an ex-ante law, and how we can look at a balanced approach. Okay, we need to regulate. There's no denying regulation, but how do we look at it futuristically? How will this be sustainable? How can we continue and be consistent with what we do? So I think here is where defining things is very important. And what Shilpi said, that markets tip very fast, but the new law doesn't talk of tipped and untipped markets. So we are dealing with platforms with multi-sided markets. They can be tipped in one market but not in many other markets, or they may still want to come up with new services. So if a Google or a big tech is in one market which is tipped, can we look at it differently from the other markets in which it is not tipped? Like we looked at Jio when it entered the market, and there was a predatory pricing, accusation against Jio. But the commission said, again, without defining it, the markets properly, it would have helped to create some jurisprudence. That is why, for consistency, we need jurisprudence as well, and we need studies as well if we want to look at it futuristically. And here is where the jurisprudence would help, where self-regulation also comes. Yes, I have been encouraging companies to self-regulate, whether the CCI says it or not, or whether any regulator government says it or not. It's important for them to de-risk themselves. But based on what? Where is the guidance? Do we have even started writing a notice for market definition where other developed jurisdictions have? Today, they are revising. The EU is revising its market definition notice. They've started taking consultation on it since November 22. So here is where today we need to take this as an opportunity. If we want the online market or the digital market to self-regulate also, or to have a balanced approach where we regulate them, but we don't kill the future competition. We need to give them some basis, whether it's through guidelines, whether it's through guidelines for penalties, notice for market definition, and so many other additional documents that the developed jurisdictions have. This is the time to actually get deeper into it, get more nuanced with market studies, and which can be complemented by these other soft regulations.
Thank you, Anupam. I will now go to Deeksha. Deeksha, over to you for your final comments as in on this.
This is very quick. I think one good thing that I saw from the discussion across panelists, each of whom have very different views about this, was the need for more study about whether we need ex ante or not. I think that's a common refrain that kept coming. And something very important and interesting that Shruti mentioned, which is lack of clarity and knowledge about how the digital markets are working. And that to me spells out caution with a capital. Before we enter into a utility side regulation that we was initially historically designed for sectors like electricity and water, let's be very mindful of what the regulatory costs are going to be for the regulator and enforcer. What will they be in terms of compliance costs for the company? What will be the cost for stakeholders? I think one of the participants mentioned about the impact on innovation. So across markets, how will over-regulation work out? And then, of course, there's an issue of regulatory arbitrage when you have 10 regulators sitting to regulate a single space. So for me, the bottom line is that ex ante needs a lot more discussion. It needs a lot more evidence-based assessment and a very detailed cost-benefit analysis. And I think finally, one other small point is the quintessential nature of the Indian markets, where we end up giving perhaps very little credit to the consumers in India. We happen to be one of the most advanced digital markets in the world, much more advanced than European consumers are. We actually saw almost a 40% drop in downloads of WhatsApp when the privacy issues came up and people were running to Signal. We saw Zoom come in right out of nowhere, not just us, this was a global phenomena. So I think there is innovation in the market. In the Indian market, there is innovation across levels by smaller players as well. And that innovation is very well responded to, at least in the Indian market, by a very, very keen, intelligent, smart consumer. So let's keep that in mind when we design a regulatory architecture which impacts consumers so closely.
Thank you so much, Deeksha. So now I will go to Bhupinder. Bhupinder, your comments.
Yeah, thanks, Amrita. So I think I've listened to all the panelists. So somewhere probably we assume that the Digital Competition Act, whatever form it may be, if it comes, would be over-regulated, would probably be not in the best interest of consumers, may stifle innovation. But probably we need to understand that as per the present structure given by the Parliamentary Standing Committee, they are talking about cities. They are talking about maybe 2, 3, 4 companies, which may, they are not talking about that, okay, if they are dominant, there is any problem. But if they are making use of their dominance for abuse, maybe on the side of consumers, on the side of other stakeholders, on the side of app developers, then they need to constrain themselves. So definitely, in any form, the Digital Competition Act is not stifling innovation. Nowhere it talks about that, okay, it would hurt consumers, because at the end of the day, if any business player, see, see the evolution of the laws in India, there was a time there was no IT law, but IT became one major force in India. And then there was a need that, okay, broadly there need to be some overarching guidelines, and IT law was established. There was no Competition Act. There was MRTP Act, but there was a need that probably as the businesses are growing, there is some abuse, so there's need of Competition Act. Now digital markets have evolved. Now digital markets, maybe we can define it 2 decades old. So there is a need to define the broad guidelines in which they need to operate. So we should not first see or presume that, okay, they need to be over-regulated, they would stifle competition, they would hurt consumers. So broadly, this is one. Second, I might like to say that when we talk about Indian market, we do understand the needs of the Indian markets are very different. So it should not be a cut copy paste arrangement. It should, because no, probably the benchmarks are available in the digital market. So definitely a lot much discussion, a lot much, effect-based studies can be there to make it as per the, needs of the Indian market. So that's all from my side.
Thank you, Bhupinder. I think those are very pertinent points. But I think, it's very important that we have divergent views, because in CCAOI, we always try to get divergent views, because that's what the discussion is all about, as in, and, how to come at some common grounds, because everyone has their valid reasons, but how do we kind of frame something which is very important. So I will go to...
Just one line.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Amita. Probably we are seeing the present form of Digital Competition Act against GAFA, right? But we should not see it in that way. Probably, like we talk about the theory of constructive distribution. So maybe 10 years down the line, there's another ABC companies. 10 years down the line, there may be XYZ. So it should not be seen as targeting some particular companies as a day, but this is a framework just to see that if there's any abuse of dominance in the digital market space, then a broad principles needs to exist. So broad, that's all from my side.
Right, thank you. Sudipto, I'll bring you in next. My question is, since, we are talking about the Digital Competition Act, but digital is mainstream. Even traditional companies are being digital in some way or the other. So the lines have blurred. So is it better to look at the competition amendment bill and bring in certain things, or create something new? Like everyone here is saying that it needs to be nuanced. We need to think about it, do our studies. We need something. Everyone agrees to it. But what needs to be done is something which needs to be done. We all agree that there needs to be some change, as in that no one says we want the same thing. But how are you looking at it? Last point.
I mean, Amrita, I would disappoint you because I don't have a ready-made solution to your hard question. But what I would say is that the discussion should not be binary. And I'm glad to see that discussion has not been binary, that whether we must have an overarching ex-ante framework or we do not need an ex-ante framework at all. I think Amol referred to the problem with the UPI, and I think this is a very valid point. In fact, UPI itself imposes a market cap on the entities. But then this also gives rise to the question that whether we focus on new solutions or we revisit the existing ones and try to improve them. For instance, if you look at the press note of 2018, it imposes specific obligations on marketplaces with respect to self-preferencing. But what has been the exact, or even there is any level of enforcement, at least I don't know. Also, I would say the need for market study should not be portrayed as overrated. At times I got that impression during the panel discussion, and especially in the Indian context, I don't think we have reached at a stage where studies, should not be a prime importance. We cannot ignore that CLRC in 2019 recommended a market study of the Indian digital markets. And it also aligns with the terms of reference of the present committee. So, but I'm not sure whether that study has been done yet. And since the terms of reference of the committee mandates the committee to look at the global practices, I mean, we can also look at the approach followed by Competition Markets Authority in UK. It initiated a study in 2019 and the final report was published in 2020, in July 2020. To sum up, I mean, I would say, if you ask me if there is a problem in the market, perhaps yes. And I would rather add that ex-ante framework is not new in India. I mean, if you look at the markets like electricity, telecom, there are already ex-ante obligations. But yes, when you talk of digital market, it's not homogeneous like electricity or telecom. And there are too many product specifications. So even if you are, hypothetically, if the committee arrives at a conclusion to create an ex-ante framework, I mean, that's fine, but then the solution has to be very precise and specific. So, I mean, the solution should not end up becoming, more, harmful than the problem itself. So I would, end on this note. Thanks, Amrita.
Can I come in?
Yes, you will come in now, ma'am. But before that, I just had
take others. I'll come in the end.
Yeah, no, you will be taking the last note, and then we'll go in for some audience comments. I just had a comment, and I think the digital markets are also regulated. It is not as if they are not regulated, but they are not regulated enough. I would say we do have the IT Act and the other regulations which they do have to follow. Perhaps certain things need to be modified. So I think that also we should be clear. We do have the IT Act, which they have to follow. Which
so
is
if I just could add one point that,
yeah.
I already mentioned that in my first round of intervention, that this committee should seriously undertake an exercise of mapping the extant laws with the problem that it wants to address before actually arriving at any new solution.
Thank you. Geeta, you have 5 minutes and then we'll take some audience questions. You may have to respond then. Over to you.
First, let me also say that what you have put at the background, maybe you should put at the side. Those points are very important on your map, It has what is being talked about. But apart from that, the important point that really needs to be made in this situation of regulation itself and the Competition Commission coming into it in the terms of the regulation is that, we really don't need to get into it. And this is something that has to be accepted because the business, so many come up and they keep fighting with each other and the ones that fall off and then come in. They get left behind in the wayside. I think that's exactly what Sudipto was trying to point at. And if you have a lot of small players coming in, it's a very good sign. It's a sign of a competitive landscape taking place. And if you want to have regulation on that, there's also the very interesting point, which I didn't make earlier, that please remember, whether it's the small players or the big players, many of them also have shareholders, which are, say, for example, you have Amazon, and Flipkart, and they have shareholders with other companies outside. So how to draw the line between a global big tech, a local big tech, a local district level big tech? It's a very complex situation that is taking place. And I think we really need to be more careful. Let the platform go with the market. Perhaps the market might function much better than putting in any sort of ex-ante regulations. And I must also congratulate CCI. The ex-ante regulations are very general. They're not something that, they only say is the government takes data. There can be a case of anti-steering. You shouldn't deal with this. If you're of this size, you shouldn't do that. But even that could be left out. There's absolutely no need, because the very fact that CCI is only concentrating on entry barrier, all the rules that are coming up are with regard to entry barrier of Section 4. If you allow the free market to function with perhaps just a little bit of, you can't have ex-ante. The electricity and telecom sector ex-ante is very different. Theirs was a case of just fixing tariffs and not on the market. But the Competition Commission, it is better to leave things alone. I mean, I know my colleague Augustine Peters somewhere in the audience, maybe he would like to add something, but I have been finding that the more and more I read and the more I look at it, it is better for the Competition Commission to play a low key. And who are the ones who come to the Competition Commission? They're the ones who want to use it and fire from the shoulders of the Competition Commission. They just want to get a better agreement. They want to get lower discounts when they're tying up or when they're signing an agreement. They're not ones who are genuinely interested in competition. I mean, I know it's perhaps something that many of you may not realize, but within the Competition Commission, there has been this sort of discussions that take place.
Thank you, Geeta. I think Saksham has a question or two questions for you. Saksham, would you like to speak up if you have some point to make and question to ask?
Yeah, hi, sure. Thank you so much. I mean, this has been, a really enlightening session. Thank you so much for letting me have a word here. So essentially, I have two questions, ma'am, for you especially. Two things. Now, of course, we've had a lot of discussion over the past hour or so about, do we need an ex-ante framework or not, and what's the feasibility, etc. And there's a consensus that there isn't enough evidence internationally on whether or not ex-ante frameworks work, because they're all very fresh. However, at the same time, there is actually maybe enough evidence or enough examples for us to see that how did these frameworks actually come into being? What was the policy making process behind it? A few speakers here, mentioned a few impact analysis reports, a few public consultations. So my question to you, ma'am, is that, need or not, like feasible or not, if we are thinking about moving in this direction over an ex-ante framework, what are the steps that we need to follow in that journey? Those steps I would like some insight on from you.
Yeah, I think those studies were very useful.
Yeah.
Someone made a wrong comment on the e-commerce study. I don't know who it was, but they've been extremely useful. And perhaps the commission should just become much more research oriented. This is, please also remember that when I keep saying economics and what are you looking at it, some of the studies show that if you use, for example, even on the digital market, you use game theory.
Yeah.
Don't get into the traditional economics of monopoly and who makes the profit, who doesn't make the profit. Because then, game theory shows that in many cases, there's really no cartel.
True.
It may happen the same in abuse of dominance. And I should say it now, but I'm hoping my book brings it all out. It's just got a very long elephantine pregnancy. The publisher says it'll come tomorrow. The tomorrow never comes. But ex-ante regulation is much more difficult to make. Is it necessary?
Yeah.
It almost amounts to stating to a teenage child, I want you back home at 8 o'clock. You can't go out there. It's that urge to control.
Yeah. No, that makes sense, ma'am. Yeah,
Right.
no, that's true. And that's one. So, of course, I completely agree with you that maybe, of course, at the very least, we do need more research, in one way or another by the CCI, by policymakers, etc. Two things, ma'am, and this is shifting gears a little bit from what the conversation has been. But this is a theme that I have been, discussing internally with peers in the policy ecosystem. And again, I apologize if this isn't completely completely on the point. But do you believe, and this is completely an outsider's perspective where I'm coming from, that do you believe that within the competition policy makers ecosystem and the CCI, is there a disproportionate attention right now on tech and digital markets? I mean, of course, not saying that the tech space or digital markets does not deserve attention right now. Of course, it permeates all aspects of our lives. However, there are other issues, there are other things that do require our attention. And I was just doing a very quick reading of, what has been done in the past few years. I think there have been around 8 26-1 orders in 2022. 4 of them have been, on tech, on digital markets. 5, if you also count the Apple order from December 2021. You look at advocacy reports, market studies, all of them, almost all of them have something to do with tech markets. We do have other markets which do maybe require attention, other concerns, and these things maybe come out. I remember an order from a few years ago of the CCI, saying, it was about labor markets, and the CCI saying that, this is a labor market issue and this is not a competition issue. Now, there might be merit to that case, but it also begs the question that, because there are other jurisdictions, the FTC and Europe have been looking at labor markets. There are other stakeholders who might be impacted by competition frameworks, in the formal workforce and the informal workforce. Point here being that there's a world outside of tech which requires attention from CCI and policy ecosystem. So, I mean, just your opinion, though, is the amount of attention we're given to tech and digital markets and competition right now, is it justified? Is it proportionate? Or, do you believe that it's also disproportionate a little bit?
Saksham, I don't know where you work, but I have the advantage now of not being in the commission or
Yes.
not being with anything, so I can be quite free.
Yes, ma'am.
There is no denying that data is very important, but there is also no denying that how is this data used, how is it assessed, and how is the preferential treatment of it coming, and why are we making such an issue of it? You see, the only thing is because it is online, you get data very quickly, but every business depends on data.
Yep.
You can't sell anything in 1991 unless you had data and knew that sports was becoming important and you needed Adidas shoes or something like that. And when you look at the products also, each, for me, I've seen, I couldn't wear those terrible sports shoes and now they're the most comfortable thing because they worked on it. So there are also positive ways of doing it. But in this case that comes up in terms of data also, you see, some of these are really not competition law.
Yeah.
They don't belong to it. The Data Protection Act, for example, the Sri Krishna Committee report, one talks to him and he says, I don't know where it is. He says, don't worry, a new data will come in. And there seems to be a little bit of uneasiness because the government wants to control the data. Public is not sure what the data will be used. And therefore, these contradictions are still coming up. But data, nonetheless, has always been important for business. That's one point I would like to say. The second thing is that competition law going in, I do think so, for the data protection bill, you can have a discussion on it. The third thing, which has not been emphasized enough, is there is just too much of the kind of, the TRI versus CCI and inter-regulatory fight, the big turf, who gets the big turf. I also think that none of these matters now. What is just required is the Data Protection Act will come. You will know what has to be used. And even with the Data Protection Act, please let me tell you that in India, we're not like Europe. See, the Europe is a worry of the Nazi past. In India, we're willing to give everything about our data when someone comes home, including in our Aadhaar, what you're ill, what you're dying of. But data becomes important. I am saying this because this data, if it is collected, it is anonymized. It doesn't have the name of Geeta, Gowri or Saksham, Malik. This data becomes very important, not only in finance and big tech, but for things like health. And therefore, I said when it's a data market, it's a new scenario that has to be worked out. How is this data protected? How is this data used? And who takes it? And please let me tell you, all the big five sell the data under different names. You just go on to Google, you'll see who sells big data, who doesn't sell big data. And we still go on to Google. No one goes to any of the other sites.
Yes. Thank you. I will just, Saksham, I'll get Sapriya into Saparya. Do you want? Yes.
Right. So I don't really have questions, but I have 2 or 3 comments, which I'll be very quick to make, and I'd love to hear any engagement on those. But it's probably going to resonate with all of Geeta ma'am's last comments. So I'm a law and economics doctoral candidate, so I come from that viewpoint. But I think it's very important to talk about the goals of competition law, right? And consumer protection or consumer welfare is really at the bedrock of all of it. And it's in that context, it's important to contextualize what consumer welfare goals are important for us in India. And EU has already moved to sustainability and so on, but where are we focusing on? Is it the price of products? Is it privacy issues? And are the answers really in competition law, like Geeta ma'am said? Like, I think competition law is one of the most stringent and strenuous forms of regulation with directly controlling the markets, and it should be always the last resort. And in that sense, we need to see if the answers really lie in data protection or corporate governance, so many other areas before we conclude that competition law is the way to go. And in that sense, I think like there's no black and white answer, right? With big tech, we don't really know that we can never, we need to shy away from going towards this big tech phobia approach, which is really seeming like what it is, because we talk about the harm so generally, but what we need is like a more, when we talk about evidence-based approach, we need a cost-benefit analysis, right? It's not black and white. What is really the direct and indirect effects of ex-ante regulation versus the ex-post adjudication approach? And in that sense, like a standard literature on regulation will tell you that the benefits of ex-ante regulation is when the frequency of violations is very high, or you want to increase legal foreseeability. In this case, like I feel like the sheer number of companies and the few violations that come about don't make a strong case for ex-ante regulation. So simply saying that ex-post regulation has failed, so we should jump to ex-ante regulation is not the right way to go about it. I think we need to ask why self-regulation has failed. Like why have we not managed to put in place enough enabling policies like disclosures or like more engagement with regulators that create enough deterrence to get companies obliged with our goals. So that's where I feel like, I mean, a lot of discussion focused on ex-ante, but I feel like it really needs to, that's a very, should be a very last resort approach in competition law. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Very valid points. I see Mr. Peter in the room. Would you like to make any comment on it? And Sudipto, I do see that you have a hard stop at 6:15, but thank you so much. Mr. Peter, would you like to make any comment here? Sorry to put you on a spot.
In the meantime, I'll just say that that's why I said the soft laws in terms of guidelines and notices will help along with the current law. So it will, the need for ex-post or ex-ante, the answer is that if you bring up these soft laws, which will be a guidance how to apply the current laws, and therefore, even if you use ex-ante laws, you will still need some sort of economics analysis, right? So it will help from that point of view.
Thank you.
Guidelines.
You want
yes,
to say
guidelines, notices.
Or are you good? Sudipto, do you want to say anything before leaving, or are you good? Because I could see Shilpi's hand up.
No, I'm good.
Okay, thank you. Shilpi, you wanted to go speak? I
just wanted to respond to that. I think that it is very clear that there is a huge information asymmetry when it comes to digital markets, which because of the way that digital markets function, the data-based business model, and our inability to ever be able to fully understand how these businesses work, and the immense incentives that digital companies have not to fully disclose their business models to us. I'm not trying to be paranoid about this, but I think this is the reality. And if we sort of look at the tremendous literature that's coming out, the fact that we have a Digital Markets Act in the EU tells us that there have been studies done that show that there is something that requires further engagement in digital markets. Business models are very different, and therefore sort of cost benefit analysis must be done. I'm not saying it doesn't need to be done, but I don't think it is in any way questionable now that there are harms coming from the way that digital business models work, the database models, and just the behavioral biases that they exploit of consumers. But in terms of innovation, I just wanted to make a quick point on innovation, that ex-ante regulation can harm innovation. So ex-ante regulation, I mean, we speak about it very broadly, and of course it could harm innovation from a broad perspective. But I think that a lot of the innovation, in terms of, the kind of innovation we want to see in digital markets is disruption, and having more competition in that space will foster that kind of disruption. Right now, the kind of innovation that we're seeing in digital markets is not encouraging the kind of disruption and that's where we see Google search is not disrupted. It's not that there aren't better products. It's just that business models are such that Google has that access to data that gives direct and indirect network effects that are so strong. So it's not that that regulation will discourage innovation. It could actually foster greater innovation by encouraging disruption of big tech.
Sorry, I would have to cut you because some of the speakers are leaving. Thank you so much, Bhupinder, for being there. And I know, Amol, you want to leave. Do you want to, quick 30 seconds, any comment you want to make, Amol, before you leave? You just messaged, and even Bhupinder, if you want to make a quick comment. Just 30 seconds, tweet.
Sure, thanks, Amrita. I'll keep it very brief. So absolutely agree with everything that has been said. We need more evidence. We need cost-benefit analysis, regulatory impact assessment. But it's true for all kinds of regulations, not necessarily only competition or only data or only e-commerce. And therefore, I think let's not think about from a very narrow approach that, okay, this is not part of a competition, traditional competition regulation, and therefore should not be discussed. But every kind of regulation needs to have more consultation, more guidance, more evidence, more cost-benefit analysis, and so on and so forth. However, when we talk about this topic, let's just sort of think beyond regulation, new regulations, fix the existing regulatory landscape, build more capacity, enhance enforcement and supervisory and market monitoring powers, ensure better communication and data collection, enable data markets to come up and operate, as Dr. Gowri has pointed out, and then also think about what else is left to regulate through an ex-ante regulation. Thank you so much, and I'll stop it. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bhupinder, do you want to end? We would be ending now, but Bhupinder, do you want to add something here? Quick.
Yeah, just one last, probably 30 seconds. Like many speakers mentioned about UPI as one of the models of India. So maybe in the Digital Competition Act also, we may talk about the contours of how Indian markets operate and what best would suit to the Indian market and work accordingly, rather than just because there are no global benchmarks, global standards as of now in the digital market competition space. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Anupam, 30 seconds for you. Anything you want?
So I would never go for a very presumptive approach, which is the present theme of the new proposed law. It's because based on fear of the structural dominance. So anything has to be more nuanced. It has to be based on some basis, some evidence, principles, something which explains the harm. So a harm-based approach, even if it is, to reduce the harm, is better than a presumptive approach, is what I would say.
Thank you. Shilpi, 30 seconds, and then I'll go to Geeta.
I completely agree with what everyone said. I don't have anything to add. I think we need to focus on harms and try to correct them, but also need to recognize that we may not fully be able to understand or be in a position to ever understand all the harms that arise from digital markets.
Thank you. Geeta, 30 seconds for you. You are the showstopper now.
But while it's just that, why are we worried about harm? Because with harm, there are also a lot of benefits that have been coming up. And I think what happens is we really are in some ways going towards a more open society. And that's what the online is allowing for in business. And in this case, I agree that you have to look at guidelines. And it's also equally important that the Competition Commission, because I was there, has to accept the fact that perhaps in many ways, the market is a better judge. When will the market not function is very difficult to understand. So there's a sort of eagerness to jump in, but one should not jump in when it's not required.
Thank you, ma'am. Very well said. And thank you to all the panelists and all of you who have been there for 16 more minutes. We had been over time, but it was very engaging. I learned a lot, and we will come up with a report. Samriddhi has been taking notes, and we'll share it with you first, just in case you have some points to be added. But thank you so much. And we hope that this is one of the more discussions we will have in this topic. And if you feel there are certain things we need to have more deliberations, we'll be glad to do so. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amrita.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, all of you.